My job at this point is to speak as a person in biblical studies, particularly about what Scot McKnight has done in the second half of the book. So let's have a few remarks then on reading the Bible and how we read the Bible in the light of Adam and the Genome and what's happened here. Adam and the Genome is founded on a very clear sequence, which, if you get the book and look at it, it's in the introduction. It's in the pages in Roman numerals that tells us that we begin with the science, assume it is correct, and then go see what that will imply about reading the Bible. So what does that look like, and what does that do for us? Or does that help us? Or does that actually lead us astray? And I can provide one piece of clarification too, just to fill in the blanks. Scot McKnight does believe in the resurrection. We were seminary students together in another geological era, many years ago. And I do too. So you have a complete sweep between Josh, myself, and Dennis and Scott. However, is this the way you should interpret the Bible? And I think the answer is no, and that is the foundational flaw in the book. So what happens? Well, there's two things, and contextual reading, as Josh has talked about, is very important. That a book means what it means. A writing means what it means in its context. The original author, the original recipients. I have to start my understanding of a text with how they read it, how they intended it, and what their world defined. So Scot correctly begins his examination of Adam and Eve by looking at Genesis as read in the light of the ancient Near East. And this is a very valuable thing to study. We have a tremendous number of cuneiform tablets and other hieroglyphic documents and so on from Canaan, Assyria, Babylon, the Hittites, Egypt, that are creation stories. They're stories of origins. And these give us all sorts of understanding of what the discussion was in the world around Genesis. Because one thing I know for sure is that in writing Genesis, the question was not, tell me about Darwin, because Darwin hadn't occurred yet. Nobody had thought of him. But if I'm an Israelite, I do know that my Canaanite neighbor or the merchant from Babylonia who came through or the Egyptian merchants traveling the other way told me stories about where everything came from. And we find out things like Marduk and Tiamat, two great gods, had a giant battle. And as a result of Marduk, the great hero god of Babylon, killing Tiamat, that's Marduk on the right and Tiamat on the left. She's not your typical grandmother, and you don't want to run into her in the alley. She will eat you alive. Marduk kills Tiamat, though, and slices her in half, and one part becomes the heavens, and the other part becomes the earth, and the story goes on. There's all this interaction between the different gods in the pantheon of Babylon. So when you read Genesis, it's essential to understand this is what's in all the cultures around Israel. There are polytheistic stories of gods who are duking it out and have all sorts of other motivations that aren't, that certainly look like they're just us. Gods in the image of man or human, and you have a number of other concerns like bringing order where there's chaos and just making sure everything's straight, but there's chaos monsters. I believe in them. They are real. They show up on my desk periodically. That try to keep creation from getting made so people could live here. So whoever's writing Genesis is informed by the world that they're in. And they're informed by the fact there's all these other questions. And when you read Genesis 1, you get this incredible statement of God is the only one. He's the only show in town. He's it. It's a statement of monotheism and of God's power and glory and beauty as a creator. And if you want to explore that more, I encourage you to get the 2 John Walton books that Josh had referred to. I see they were also for sale out in back. The Lost World of Genesis 1 and The Lost World of Adam and Eve. They are an excellent introduction to this way of reading Genesis, and they do it without being, in a sense, steered by a conclusion from science. It's in its own integrity, its own right within the discipline of biblical studies. The second thing that Scot does is he wants to read Genesis in the light of Second Temple Judaism and apply that to Paul. And of course, that's the highlight, because Scot is a New Testament scholar. So that's really what I was looking forward to when I was reading this. And what he lays out for us looks something like this. He affirms that in Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament, and in Second Temple Judaism, which will have implications for Paul, there are many varied ways in which we talk about Adam and Eve. And so he starts to list these. First, there's the historical Adam and Eve, that Adam and Eve were real persons. And we'll come back to that idea because it turns out to be a pivot point for Scot later. So in the story of Genesis, it establishes there was an Adam and an Eve in a garden. And there you have your literary Adam and Eve, the Adam and Eve of the Bible. So if you're going to talk about them as real persons, there's a picture of them in the garden. If you're going to talk about them in the text, there they are in the garden again. It gives you a clear story and an expression of who they are. So the literary Adam and Eve are part of a narrative. And it's a narrative, when we read them in the Genesis literary narrative, that gives us an understanding of who we are as humans, made in the image of God, and it gives us some understanding of what humans are called to do, that we work under and alongside our God and continue his work of creating. Then Scot distinguishes the genealogical Adam and Eve. In other words, Adam and Eve show up. If you've got the historical and literary Adam and Eve, they're in Genesis 2 and 3. Genealogical Adam and Eve, we meet in Genesis 5, where we get the first of those rousing genealogies that you love in your quiet times, which list all the people in their generations. And beginning with Genesis 5 and on, Adam and Eve show up at the fountainhead of the human genealogical line, so that we, by implication, are all descendants of Adam and Eve. Then there is the archetypal Adam and Eve, or the idea that it's a moral, ethical Adam, that Adam is actually a paradigm for all of us. And that when you read Genesis, there's the uncomfortable feeling as you see Adam that he looks a lot like me and you. That I can get mad at Adam for having eaten the fruit and introduced the sin, the jerk. But I know that if I were put in the garden in reality, the second God says, not that tree, I'd beat a path over there and sample the fruit. And one of the marvelous things about the way the story is told is that it works so well that way that we recognize ourselves in the text. Adam is an archetype. He's a paradigm for all of us. And in particular, Scot links this with the book of Ecclesiasticus, an apocryphal or pseudepigraphal book, or also called Ben Sirach, from around the 2nd century BC, where the discussion is Adam as everyone. He's really everyone all at the same time. Then there's Adam as a Hellenistic wise man, wisdom Adam, wisdom that is immortal and brings justice. Adam was shaped by true wisdom, and he observed the Torah, which produced immortality, the basic presentation of Adam in a document from this period between the Testaments called the Wisdom of Solomon. And then there's philosophical Adam, or the Logos Adam. Adam is a paradigm of the Greek theory of the human who consists of both body and soul. This is Philo of Alexandria, who was more than willing to take Genesis and use it in service of a foreign agenda, a Greek agenda, not a Hebrew agenda at all. And then there's Torah observant Adam. Adam leads us on the way to a stricter obedience to the Torah, or the law. And this is from the book of Jubilees, as Scot explains it. In particular, important to distinguish us Jews as different from people around us. That it is part of the distinguishing marks of Judaism that we lay this out and follow Adam, who helps us obey, not just obey the Bible, but obey the things that make it clear that we're not Greeks or Romans or Syrians or Persians, we're Jewish. Then there's Roman Adam. And this is the first century Jewish historian Josephus, who wanted to portray an Adam that he could interpret in a manner that made Adam more palatable to Roman thought and values. Adam is an archetype of virtue and serves as an example for us in living. The book of 4th Ezra gives us Adam as everyone. The fallen, that's 2nd Baruch. Each of us has, I think I went two slides there. Roman, and then, okay, took two at once. Okay, fallen Adam. Moral Adam fell. But the difference in 4th Ezra is that his fall and introduction of sin has implications for every human. Adam stands at the fountainhead of sin on through the generations. Now, 4th Ezra is not talking about what people in theology subsequent to the New Testament and the apostles talk about as original sin. It's not what he's saying, because he still will confront the problem as it's us Israelites, we keep sinning and choosing wrong, so it doesn't get us off the hook that there is original sin. Then 2nd Baruch has this idea of Adam as everyone, with the particular coloration that his sin brought corruption to all. But you're still individually responsible. 2nd Baruch 54:19, in case you haven't done that in quiet time recently. Quote, each of us has become our own Adam, end quote. Well, Scott's established the point that in the period of Second Temple Judaism, in other words, after the Old Testament has closed, the Hebrew Bible's done, and we're coming to and into the period of the New Testament, in Jewish thought, for which we have rich resources of different works, people talk about Adam in all kinds of different ways. Fantastically interesting. He also says that when you look at Paul, and he goes through particularly passages in 2 Corinthians 5, and in Romans 5, in which he says what Paul says about Adam and Eve picks up on three of these. Paul's Adam and Eve, the literary, the one we find in the text, the genealogical, the one in the genealogies from whom we all descend, and of course the archetypal, moral Adam that confronts us with ourselves and our own tendency towards sin. And then makes the startling and not explained, or at least certainly not adequately explained, statement that for Paul, Adam is not historical Adam. Well, how could this be? He explains what he thinks historical Adam refers to. So here we go. There are 7 characteristics that Scot says are what we're talking about usually in our culture when we say historical Adam. 1, 2 actual persons existed suddenly as a result of God's creation. 2, those 2 people have a biological relationship to all humans alive today. 3, their DNA is our DNA. 4, those two people sinned, died, and brought death into the world. 5, those two passed on their sin natures to all human beings. 6, thus we are all in need of salvation. 7, to deny the historical Adam is to deny the gospel of salvation. Well, that's quite a mouthful. And what he's trying to do is good in its intention, which is define, okay, we're talking about these different terms, let's define them. But there's a problem with this. And it's quite simply that this needs simplification. This is a setup, in a sense, a well-intentioned setup, but it allows us to rule out historical Adam. I'd like to propose that what we should do is simplify that definition to what most of us probably do mean by historical Adam. 1, two actual persons existed suddenly as a result of God's creation. 2, I got this in brackets because it could be up for some discussion. Those two have a biological relationship to all humans alive today, and so I'm putting that in brackets because it's usually been part of the discussion, but I want to put it to the side and not say that we're certain it has to be part of the discussion. And his 4, those two sinned, died, and brought death into the world. The rest of it is not historical Adam. And that's part of the problem with the discussion, because it enables him to set up a straw Adam and knock him down. And unfortunately, when you talk about Adam, what you're talking about, if you say historical, really evokes the idea that Adam and Eve were real persons. So maybe we need to retitle it Real Person Adam, or something like that, instead of calling it historical. If you look at that whole list, he's got things like original sin in there, which is a post-New Testament. It's a church doctrine. Augustine responsible largely for the way that's been talked about in the church. So that's not part of historical Adam in anybody's imagination, except if you want to knock it down. At page 189, Scott says, I would contend that Paul, like the Jews of his day, would have thought that the literary Adam and Eve were also the genealogical Adam and Eve, and that as such, they were persons in the history of Israel. So we have several things in one of these key statements. Paul, what did he think? Well, who's Paul? Paul's an apostle. He is an inspired author of Scripture. The Spirit is working in him, and one of the understandings that we have from the New Testament and the Old of inspiration of Scripture is that what he will affirm is true. He won't affirm anything false. So it's important to me to know what he's affirming and whether or not he's affirming. And that's actually 2 steps there. So he says, first of all, the literary Adam and Eve are also the genealogical Adam and Eve, which in one sense says nothing, because where is literary Adam and Eve? Where are they? They are hanging out in the text of Genesis. Where is genealogical Adam and Eve? He and she are hanging out in the text of Genesis. Of course they're the same thing. They talk about 2 different aspects of them, but it's almost impossible that he could have separated them. That as such, they were persons in the history of Israel in Paul's mind. Now, to me, that's really important. So we need to simplify the definition of historical, that there's 2 real persons, and they're the result of God's creation. Put in brackets the idea they're our ancestors. They sinned, they died, and they led the way in sin as a paradigm or an archetype. Almost all the Jewish authors that are quoted talk about Adam and Eve in all these other ways, but I have a strong, sneaking suspicion that if you sat them down and said, do you believe Adam was a real person, all but one of them would have said, absolutely. Even though we're talking about him in these other ways, he's a lesson for us, he teaches us, he guides us, but yes, this was a real person and a real event. Philo's the exception. Philo happily allegorized everything into oblivion so that nothing actually had to be real in the Old Testament. But the others all likely believed that Adam was a real person. So the argument doesn't work because, indeed, they talked about him in this way, but it doesn't mean that any of them, probably except Philo, believed that Adam wasn't a real person. So everything erodes at that point. So how do we constructively address this? A few closing comments about where do we go. One, what did the author intend to affirm? That's a basic question here. And it's possible as I read Romans 5 that Paul isn't interested in affirming Adam is a real person or not. I have to answer that question first. Now he might be. It might be based on that, and it might not be. But that's important because as a follower of Jesus, I submit to the scriptures and they teach truth in everything they affirm. So I need to think about this. What then did the author think? So what's in their minds? What could the author have known in that day, which we've already talked about with Genesis and now we address with Paul? Probably, high likelihood, Paul saw Adam as a real person, historical Adam, not including original sin, because Paul doesn't teach original sin. I think Scot's got that absolutely correct. But that's not part of the historical Adam question. Real person Adam. As a follower of Christ, these questions are really important. Implications? Well, I come to the same point Josh did. What about Jesus? How does he fit in with all of this? And why does the church find so many of these discussions off-putting? Well, one of the reasons is because we're not answering that question in this context. And I think that the book in another edition would do well to address that more because it raises questions. Your method of interpreting, or your hermeneutic, if you want to use the fancy word for it, is unresolved if you start from science as providing you a final and definitive answer, which the book does, and the Bible section does. The Bible is then, or theology is then, not actually a dialogue partner in this. It raises questions in the church. And Josh has already suggested this and led you towards it, that the questions, of course, are if I say, I used to read Genesis this way, but now science has shown evolution that has shown that I can't read it this way. I have to come up with a new hermeneutic to read the Bible because I am under the impulse of evolution and science, which is basically what Scot's doing. We have to keep going. So where will science take you when you examine the resurrection of Jesus? There's no question. It will say it didn't happen. So then we'll have to give that up, right? Well, that's the problem with the argument. It raises questions in the church. What about the miracles? What about the gospel accounts? What about the resurrection of Jesus? You can't let that go. So it's proper in your interpretation to use cultural context, as we're doing with both Genesis and the Second Temple Judaism. That's all good. That's important for looking at and seeing how the Bible authors were thinking about things. But the book we need doesn't go from science to the Bible. We need a study and a discussion and books about this that look at science in its own right and Bible in its own right, and then bring the two together. And then we have a platform to talk about real person Adam or not that will be fair to both sets of data without pushing one overboard. And of course, when you use cultural context, it lets you understand the text more clearly, more accurately. And these are texts that ultimately, Old Testament, New Testament, do point to Jesus Christ. It's a path to seeing Christ more clearly. And it leads us to Bible and science as a dialogue partner, pair, instead of separated. We have to begin, as Joshua has said, at the empty tomb. It is the words of the angels. He is not here, he is risen. On that, Christianity rises or falls. If Christ is not risen, we are of all people most hopeless. Paul, 1 Corinthians 15. It is a personal encounter with a living Jesus Christ that brings people into the kingdom, into the family of God. That's where we need to go. And that's where we need to start. And this discussion has implications for how the church will handle and think about questions such as the resurrection and the claims of Jesus Christ. So we need to look at both. So it leaves us then with the empty tomb, which may be a surprising place to have both Josh's main presentation and my brief comments lead us back to, that really that's where we start, and we need to be able to come back there as a result of this discussion as well.